We've seen a lot of great movies, but there have also been a mind-numbing slog of rehashes and remakes. Movies and TV shows trying to recapture audiences by playing to this strange need for nostalgia. This is why, to start off the shiny new decade, I thought it would be fun to take a look at two remakes that share a common denominator. So, sit back and relax as we dive into the world of Stephen King and two of his most notable works, Pet Sematary and It. Both of these films have a particular stigma around them as far as the books are concerned, and while its job was to surpass a previous incarnation loved by fans of all shapes and sizes, Pet Sematary had a different, more interesting hurdle to jump over. Its original incarnation was regarded by everyone, including the big man himself, to be his scariest work. How do you manage to make an adaptation when your source material has that kind of expectation around it? Simple. You don't. No, surely not. That must be a lie. I will explain. And this is true for all adaptations. There is absolutely no way you'll get a perfect adaptation for a book to a movie or even to a TV show. Why? They're diverse mediums and at their core function in different ways. To remain in the spirit of that core is the only thing an adaptation can do, while making changes to update things to the current times. There's also the issue of Pet Sematary being mostly a character drama slash psychological thriller that happens to also deal with the undead. This inevitably means, as part of the regular of the world we live in, majority of viewers zone in on one idea that's popular at the time and disregard everything else that there was to offer. In Pet Sematary's case, the only thing people think about is the undead part of the story, causing it to get a rather negative reception because that doesn't come around until well into the hour of both films and the third act of the book. I'll get more into the specifics on this later when we start talking about the plot, but for now, let's take a look at our first category. Shortest version of that story ever, family moves to Maine, family dies to supernatural corruption. Starting off this story of death and woe, we have Lewis Creed, the undeniable main character. Lewis is the person that the viewer is supposed to relate to, the one that we empathize with, while also finding him agreeable. The actor in charge of accomplishing this task is Jason Clarke, and I gotta say, he looks half dead from the start of the movie. There's barely any build up to the madness, since you look at him and go, dude, what side of whose couch did you wake up on? Dale Midkiff, who played Lewis in the previous version, has visible steps to his character. You can literally see his decline till you're left with nothing but a broken shell of a broken man. Looking at the two of them during different parts of the story, it's hard to get emotionally behind a man that we're just waiting to have a fight with some sort of supernatural thingum with little to no explanation. There's also little to no chemistry on screen between him and the rest of his family, making it that much easier to feel like you're just watching a story instead of getting engrossed in it. Horror requires getting your audience sucked into the story and the environment so that the scares and emotions feel real. That panic and desperation, we need to be feeling that or it ends up just being pictures on a big screen. We see that every day. What makes this so special? His delivery is also fairly dry, save this part. And even then, that was for a fake out. When we get the real reaction to the accident, it is laughably stiff and unrealistic. I remember reading a few reviews before going to see this in theaters. People had been complaining about how unemotive he was during the cemetery scene with his one tear, so I waited eagerly for that part and practically bounced out of my seat when there was, in fact, 2 tears. Don't get me wrong, when you're in shock, tears aren't something that always happen. Even if they do, you're not necessarily aware or even in control of them. So him standing there with a blank face, looking like his mind is somewhere else that rhymes with met shemulary, I could give that a pass. If he didn't usually look like that. But he does. So I can't. Moving on to It has its own challenges, the main cast consisting of 7 characters in total, each managing to be as important as the last. First, we have William Denbrough, called Bill by most people in the film, played by Jaden Martell and James McAvoy. Bill is the accidental leader of the Losers Club and the big brother of the first victim we're introduced to. Pennywise has been doing this for a very, very long time, but King decides to really twist that knife by making the first death a small cinnamon roll of a boy. In all versions, this gives Bill lots of motivation and courage to do what he needs to get done. However, in this new version, they change a crucial detail that gives this Bill even more reason to push forward. Previously, the children, including Georgie, were found murdered by Pennywise, mutilated or broken. Georgie survived the initial attack but then died from his wounds, and Bill's parents blamed him for his death. In this one, Georgie just goes missing, like the rest of the children, and Bill goes on a summer-long campaign to find him. Helping him do this is Richie Tozer, played by Finn Wolfhard and Bill Hader. He's the comedian of the group that, in all honesty, really doesn't know how to shut up. But it ends up working out in the end, and he plays that to his advantage, especially in his profession, which they changed to a very smart stand-up comedian. Following him, we have Eddie Kaspbrak, played by Jack Dylan Gazer and James Ranson, who is a germaphobe to the utmost degree and has been controlled by his mother by saying that he has literally every disease known to man. And this makes it really difficult for him to connect with people except the Losers Club. Stanley Uris is played by Wyatt Oleff and Andy Bean. Stanley is a shy boy that doesn't talk very much and has an obsession with birds, which they surprisingly leave out in this iteration. They focus more on his Jewish background and how his father is not very proud of him in the least. Mike Hanlon is played by Chosen Jacobs and Isaiah Mustafa. Both do an excellent job portraying the outsider. And in this version, they change some details with young Mike and older Mike. Older Mike is the one that stays in town, but instead of having a drug addiction and living on top of the museum/library, he ends up being more of a police officer, researcher type person. But in this iteration, I think it works much better that he kind of turns into this madman because he's the only one that remembers and isn't allowed to talk about it. Benjamin Hanscom is played by Jeremiah Ray Tyler and Jay Ryan. He's the new kid, so obviously nobody likes him. He's also fat, for lack of a better word, and he doesn't have any friends for a majority of the first act, but when he does get together with the Losers Club, everything kind of blossoms and gets better. He's the one that turns his whole life around, gets in shape, is really successful, just to try and cover up his constant ache and pain of feeling lonely. And rounding off this marathon of a cast is Beverly Marsh, played by Sophia Lillis and Jessica Chastain. She is the whore, the slut, the person that people think is too mature and just sleeps with everyone, and that she should be avoided because of that. when in reality she hasn't actually slept with anyone and she just hit maturity quicker than other people. She also has a creepy abusive father that they heavily hint sexually abuses her on a fairly regular basis, and if not, a psychological basis for sure. With all that, we could literally be here all night talking about each of these characters individually, so let's settle for talking about the cast as a group, since it's the unity of the losers that overcomes the evil. While each person has a lot of diversity and personality, it's easy to get lost into the sheer amount of information that's given to you, let alone how many relationships you have to keep track of. Mike and Stanley suffer the most from this overload, being nearly to practically non-existent for most of the film. All of the losers stand alone fairly well, Richie, Bill, and Bev in particular, who seem to get the best lines and the best scenes. The adult and the child cast both have excellent chemistry on screen, making it easy to stay engaged and entertained. You can also relate with all of the losers, not because of the big scary clown after them, but because of their own personal devils and demons. Beverly and Stan's father, Ben's bullies, Eddie's mom, Bill's parents, Mike's family, and Richie, who in this version struggles with the town's homophobia. All of these are common issues that any audience could sympathize with, and the solid acting behind them makes it all the more powerful. This can, on the other hand, make it feel like there's too much with one person happening at the same time, or contrary-wise, too little when there is a lot of information from individuals that need to happen all in a row. I will say that the miniseries did not handle this problem as well as the movie, and it is a minor gripe comparatively speaking. And what's your protagonist without an antagonist? Each film has a touch of man versus self and man versus monster, so I want to go and touch on self before we go forwards with monster. Pet Sematari's main antagonist is grief. And again, I hear you say, surely not, it must be the zombies. For one, in the 2019 adaptation, they're undead. I'm sorry, no flesh eating, no zombie. At that point, you're just a lame vampire. I wanted to see a man get his throat ripped out with a little girl's teeth, and instead I got a classic horror cop-out. For two, the main motivation of the main character is wrestling with the loss of a child and what to do when given an option to have just a little more time. Lewis is established as a scientist who doesn't believe in anything after death, a man of logic and reason. Slowly, things start happening around him, and that faith begins to weaken, events that can't be explained, no matter how hard he tries, and then the accident happens. Having to go through the death of a child isn't easy, and for a man who's already got cracks in his shell, this was all he needed for him to start his descent. There's also the unseen supernatural force behind the Indian burial ground. The Wendigo, who is actually mentioned in this version, is generally described as a monster with human characteristics or as a spirit who has possessed a human, causing them to become monstrous. Its influence is said to invoke the acts of murder, insatiable greed, and cannibalism, thus the zombie. The Wendigo itself is usually depicted as gaunt to the point of emaciation, its skin pulled so tightly over its bones that they would start poking through its ash-gray flesh. Suffering from suppuration of the flesh, the Wendigo constantly would give off a strange and eerie odor of decay and corruption, which they constantly reference as smelling like the ground you buried him in the story. A traditional Wendigo did not require death to be able to possess a human, or for a normal human to become a Wendigo. The myth served more as a warning that excessive want and need to eat flesh, or the possessions of others, should be avoided. Stephen King's Wendigo not only required them to be dead, but for their body to be inside the burial circle as well. It served more as a personification of evil, a vague creature looking like black inkiness with yellow-gray eyes and white vapors coming from its nostrils. This, ironically, gives it a less menacing presence, and as it's not the focus of the story, can be glazed over without really missing anything, as the 1989 version did. The 2019 version of The Wendigo seems to be neither, as the writers and producers couldn't decide if they wanted to just stick with one or the other. Thus, we get this bizarre bastardization of both versions that seemingly has no pattern or motivations. If it was traditional, there would have been way more flesh eating, and it wouldn't have really stopped with the Creed household. Spreading like a disease is what it's supposed to do. If it was the King version, there should have been more hate towards those who caused the dead to rise and spread misery around the town while luring more people to use the burial ground. But what do we get? Heart-jerking agony. And we get this! Anyway, changing the child who gets hit from Gage to Ellie was a decision that a lot of people heavily disagreed with. I was not one of those people. However, after seeing the movie, I'm not completely in the Ellie is better camp. I agree that Ellie, played by Jet Lawrence, is more intimidating because she's older and can get physical without worrying about traumatizing her little wife. Dennis Widmyer went on record saying, much of how they shot the first movie was with a doll. It's creepy and it's effective. But now we've seen child's play and we've seen little kids trying to kill. It's effective when it's done right, but... Between the first incarnation of Pet Sematary to the recent, there have been 40 killer doll movies made, so I suppose I can agree with that statement. However, there are new ways of making things like that happen these days, and making a creepy, decaying 3-year-old would no longer require the use of a doll, strictly speaking. Changing the roles around also affected how the story evolves later in the movie, inevitably creating a huge plot hole, which I'll go into later. Look at these back to back. Gage is unsettling and, because of his size, has to be more of a trap hunter than a wild aggressor. Ellie just seems to be playing up the I'm sweet card, even though it's obvious that it's not working. If you can't charm any of your victims, why bother at that point? That being said, Jet Lawrence really does steal the show. Her and John Lithgow are easily the best parts of the whole project, fitting into the macabre aura that hangs over the entire movie, while still managing to capture their audience with their performance, but enough to ignore scriptural shortcomings. Its story, on the other hand, is more man versus monster focused, each of the children dealing with their own problems, but the main antagonist remaining the disturbingly colorful Pennywise the Dancing Clown. He was played by Tim Curry for the miniseries and Bill Skarsgård for the 2017-2019 movie. Its biggest challenge is, how do you make a killer clown be genuinely frightening while still keeping it ridiculous at the same time? I have no idea how he managed this, but Andy Muschietti managed to do it again, and again, and again, and again. Don't get me wrong, there are some silly parts that are just silly. And the second half of the movie did finally find its sense of humor. But this movie has the uncanniest way of perfectly blending something that should be completely preposterous but horrifying at the same time throughout the entirety of the movie. After all, he's a clown. That's how he lures people in. There should be some whimsy about in there somewhere. Yeah, and then he eats you. As far as the performance is concerned, it's top-notch. Taking advantage of the various disturbing things Skarsgård could already do with his body, Muschietti expands on that to the point where you're not sure this is what he really looks like. They also make it so that Pennywise never really interacts with the outside world when he's torturing someone. It's as if they go into a little temporal bubble that Pennywise can then manipulate how he pleases, including the shadows of the people around them. In the previous version, Curry basically runs around the set being goofy or scary, which worked for that version. This one takes itself a little more seriously, which is a welcome change. This may seem unfair, but I gotta say that the point goes to It, coming out on top with an 8.5. While Ellie was great to watch, the lackluster performance of her father brings their score down to a disappointing 6 out of 10. I would absolutely given the point to Pet Sematary despite it having twice the time to develop its characters, but it only had one main character. That means that role has to be really solid. And in this instance, unfortunately, that just does not happen. The supporting cast is where Pet Sematary really starts to shine. The performances from Amy Seimes well outweighing the emotionless cardboard cutout of her foil. She plays Rachel Creed, a woman haunted by her past as well as the memory of her long-deceased sister. The incident leading up to her sister Zelda's death left the woman jaded and scarred, unable to even broach the subject of death, let alone confront it. This ends up causing tension between her and Lewis, who stands by the fact that all things die and there's nothing wrong with preparing their kids for that eventuality. In the previous iteration, Lewis is more supportive of Rachel, and it ends up being relatively forgotten that she has a severe hang-up with the idea of death. In this version, it hangs on to those beliefs, and it prevents her from accepting the reality in front of her. That deviation is both a great decision and a huge hindrance on the director's part, adding a level head to an otherwise unlevel situation, but also limiting her emotions. All throughout the entire film, we're constantly beaten over the head about her nightmarish relationship with her sister when she fell ill, and when I say beaten, I mean beaten. This version spends nearly 15% of the running time just throwing in Zelda for spookiness, while the 1989 version kept it contained to around 6%. Why do I think it's a problem when they more than double her screen influence? As stated before, this isn't supposed to just be about creepy monsters and undead children. They are a secondary entity to the real antagonist, a concept that requires more character growth to be empathetic towards than boogie 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 boogie. So yeah, taking away so much time from the plot when it could be used to really grow relationships and getting us attracted to the characters that are going to die, which is most of them, I say is a bad idea. Speaking of most of them, next on the list to die, which was technically first, is Victor Pascal, played by Obasa Ahmed in the 2019 version and Brad Greenquist in the 1989 version. A pivotal character in previous versions, he is reduced to a really poor warning that shows up sorta kinda not really. Cool, we get to see his brain. Great. He's supposed to be constantly helping to keep the Creed family from falling into the clutches of the Wendigo. In the 1989 version, it had him getting Rachel on planes and flagging down trucks to get her home, cautioning her that Lewis was in grave danger from himself. We see him in the back seat while Rachel is stuck in traffic. That's it. All he does is scare the living daylights out of a toddler and then goes and jerks off somewhere. Ahmed does a fine job with the material given to him, despite his character getting a huge axe. Judd Crandall, this time played by the very talented John Lithgow, was almost too added onto. Most people were concerned that he wouldn't be able to live up to the shadow cast by Fred Gwynne, who gave the role more life than the film he was in had. Those concerns were unnecessary, as the performance we got was stunningly memorable, giving its own unique take to a heartwarming character. With a few minor exceptions. In the original version, there is chapters and chapters of details of Judd's life, specifically surrounding his wife, that had to be left out of the 1989 version because they weren't completely necessary to understand the story, and there were other, more important things that the director wanted to get on with. The 2019 version tries to include some of those things, but instead of enhancing the story or characters, becomes confusing deadweight that serves no real purpose but to waste time. Not a lot of time, as it's just a minute or so, but again, It's never touched on, and it comes right out of the blue, giving you more questions than answers during a part where you should be engrossed on the coming gruesome death. There's also the issue of Judd's character being a little too creepy in this version. The man has his demons, but he's the example of learning from his past mistakes and being able to embrace the happier side of death, living in the memories and sharing love in other ways. Most of the time, he seems like an outsider who has way more skeletons in his closet than he actually does. But he does bond with Ellie in a genuine way, and his chemistry with Lewis isn't unseen. And, as I said before, he is easily one of the more gratifying parts of the movie. On that note, we'll move right along to Georgie Denbar, who is Bill's little brother and the main motivation pushing him forward. Tony Dakota does a remarkable job with the role of first victim in It, seamlessly pulling off both innocence and sinister intent. Every time he's on screen, he's either pulling your heartstrings or making you go, ah! Child actors can be very hit and miss, but Dakota, he's definitely a hit. Same goes for Gerard Blanchard, who plays the undeniably psychotic Henry Bowers. The biggest complaint for the king bully trope is that they're very one-dimensional, thus making them boring to watch. That right there, that's not boring. He continually looks like he's one step away from ripping someone's throat out with his bare hands. Even his gang recognizes his instability, always standing a few steps behind him so they don't get caught in one of his fits. And when he's an adult, the man is just cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. Michael Cole is no newcomer to the big screen, and his performance, albeit brief, is a vast improvement to his predecessor. The problem with these two characters ends up being that they just don't have enough screen time for them to have a major impacting role. Strictly character depth. The film wouldn't work without them, but they're not the most fleshed out of the bunch. With that in mind, Pet Sematary does manage to handle this category better, edging out The Point with a 7.4 out of 10, It right at its heels with a 6.2. Hey everyone, I just wanted to apologize. Sick earlier in the week and could not complete the full review in time for today. So, I will be releasing part 2 next Sunday, same time, same place. Stay safe, stay sweet, and remember,